There are three men arguing about an elephant in the next room. First man argues that the elephant is red and green and paisley with plaid legs, of which it has 6, and orange trunks, of which it has 2, easily the tackiest elephant ever devised. He goes on to insist that the elephant has gossamer wings, of which it has no need since it can levitate with its mind, and it has the ability to solve problems so long as they have not been asked. In short, this elephant is nothing at all like an elephant. The second man argues that the elephant is a perfectly ordinary elephant, both internally consistent and consistent with our experience of elephants. The third argues that there is no elephant at all. The question I posed in this video is, in what sense can the second man be said to be defending the views of the first? It's a question of identity. The purpose of Christian apologetics is to defend a belief in God and in Christ, to make such a belief reasonable, to provide intellectual foundations sturdier than blind faith for theism as a whole. I like to call attention to the fact that Christian apologetics has not, does not, and can never achieve its aim so long as it carries on as it has. The reason being that the God of apologetics and theology is decidedly not the God of common belief, and that as such, even if we allow that the arguments of apologists succeed as arguments, apologetics as a whole still fails. It's almost as if the apologists are members of a sophisticated cult, quite apart from mainstream religion. Every now and then a lot of noise gets made about the definition of God. It's one of my favorite points in the God debate, the utter meaninglessness of the very word the whole conversation is about. Sometimes the problem isn't that it's meaningless, but that it has too many meanings, many of which are mutually exclusive. Whatever the case, conversations about the meaning of the word God are held in almost perfect isolation from any other conversations about God. Regardless of what definitional strengths or weaknesses a definition possesses, the conversation will proceed with a much more colloquial definition anyway. The tendency to ignore the problem of an operational definition of God when discussing God is the fault of believers and unbelievers alike, and often enough they each ignore it for the same obvious reason. Most people know what God is supposed to be, roughly, and they don't want to trouble about specific characteristics and features. We all have a good idea what is meant by that word, God. But the most common essential features are the omnis, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. People will often go on to declare that God's omnibenevolent, whatever that means. But this isn't all. Very few people subscribe to a belief in an impersonal God, a God without a personality, without emotions, without desires. So another characteristic we accept, even if we don't explicitly identify it, is that God is personal. And then there are the parts of God which seem to be relational. He is the entity which hears and sometimes answers prayers. He is the prime mover, the architect of heaven and earth, the progenitor of free will, the author of morality, and the supreme arbiter of cosmic justice. And then there are those who insist without any sense of irony that right alongside a number of the aforementioned characteristics, God is inscrutable and that his qualities and depths cannot be understood. This is God, as explicit and comprehensive as I can make him. Like so many others, I've left out what he is and have merely discussed what he can do and what he is not. But that's another matter. The point is, this is, give or take, the God that the average person believes in. I don't think it would be difficult to demonstrate that the overwhelming majority of believers maintain these divine characteristics in their simplest, crudest form either. For instance, most believers, certainly the majority of the laity, maintain that omnipotence means that God has an utterly unbounded will, that there is nothing he can't do should he choose to. God can make square circles and rocks so heavy he can't lift them, and they casually assume there is some way that this works out in the end because, after all, God has an unbounded will. It requires no further reflection. They also find no difficulty in imagining a creature with an unbounded will that can coherently be said to possess desires, an idea which seems patently absurd to me. But apologists categorically reject such contradictions. While this is an obviously smart play, it does constitute a distinction between the God they believe in and the God of common belief. This is the first and most obvious reason apologetics cannot be seen as defending common belief. Common belief is, commonly enough, utterly indefensible. But when we encounter apologists, people who explicitly rely upon reason, not faith, to articulate their belief in a higher power, far from simply eschewing such indefensible particulars, they give different definitions for these ideas, and often invoke entirely new characteristics for God. For instance, metaphysical necessity is mentioned nowhere in the Bible, and you will never hear it spoken from the pulpit. It's an intellectual trinket. It has nothing to do with belief and practice for the overwhelming majority of believers. But there may be an even deeper problem for the common believer and the apologist alike when it comes to the arguments for God's properties. Monotheists go further than the claim that each of these disparate features of God's are internally consistent, and they go further than maintaining that they are mutually compatible. They go so far as to positively assert that these ideas are necessarily conjoined to one another. While defending this idea as the only or most reasonable way to look at the world, they abjectly dismiss the perfectly coherent idea that one entity could have authored morality and another could have created the universe, or that one God could have done these things and yet there is another God that answers prayers quite independently of the activities of the other. This I will call the problem of unity. You see, when apologists argue for the existence of God, they typically only argue for one or two of the above characteristics at any given time. When an apologist argues for the need for a first cause, they are arguing for a creator God. In the next breath, he can go on to argue for a God who is the author of morality, but I know of no additional argument which unites the two initial arguments and makes the case that each of the two gods being argued for are the same God. Cosmological arguments argue for first causes, not moral foundations. Moral arguments argue about moral foundations, but not intelligent oversight. Teleological arguments do that. Each of these types of argument drives at a particular feature. None of them drive at all of God's features. So what ties them to one another? Often enough, it's nothing more than a familiar and hollow three-letter word: God. When a Christian apologist argues for something, he often concludes his argument with, "That thing we call God." If you finish all of your arguments this way, the inattentive might not notice that's not actually what you're arguing for. The trick becomes more obvious when you note that the proper conclusion to an argument for a moral foundation, for example, is, "Therefore a moral foundation exists." Not, "Therefore a moral foundation exists and we call it my cousin Carl." Or try this, "Therefore the chicken pot pie exists and we call it God." If you think big-name apologists don't do that, have a look at William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. His is one of the more obvious examples. The knee-jerk reaction is to invoke parsimony, commonly referred to as Occam's razor. But this is not an argument. It's a principle, and it's actually being ignored if you posit one God every bit as much as if you posit two. Consider, is the simpler explanation to conclude that all the murders in a major city are perpetrated by a single individual, or is it actually simpler to conclude that many people are responsible, some perhaps for more than one? If you think you've proven that the universe had a cause, congratulations, but all you've proven is that the universe had a cause. In the crime analogy, this is nothing more than establishing that a particular death was in fact a murder. Another attempt to consolidate gods is to either create a new characteristic, which really doesn't need to be any more clever or complicated than the quality of divine unity, like arguments from God's simplicity. You'll note, by the way, that God's simplicity is another of those ideas which is largely absent from common belief and is only conjured ad hoc when it's convenient. When you ask the average believer to explain what God is, very seldom will they call him simple. In fact, one of the ironies of this particular characteristic is that God is usually only said to be simple after hours of elaboration on his myriad characteristics. Then there is the argument from God's perfection, which comes in a variety of forms, but always takes as a premise God's perfection, with one glaring oversight. Where are the arguments for God's perfection? Some argue, as the Muslims do, that multiple gods would leave the world in chaotic disarray, and apparently we don't find that, at least not when it's inconvenient to find that. But really, there's no reason there couldn't be multiple gods of different domains, and there's no reason to think they wouldn't or couldn't act in concert, or independently, yet perfectly harmoniously. And the Bible makes explicit and implicit mention of other gods, by the way. So it seems there's a problem where apologetics is concerned. It wants to make the case for God, but it never actually makes the case for God. Not one God, and not the God of the average person on the street. The gods of sophisticated Western theology are carefully considered. They are, in many respects, very well developed as far as such abstract concepts go. Except, of course, that there are so many of them, and no real idea unites them. These gods' characteristics are carefully crafted to avoid logical problems as well as they can, and to include as many of the classical qualities associated with God as they may, except they can never seem to get them all, or even very many. Even if we assume that the arguments commonly embraced by theologians and apologists work, you still have a gap between those arguments and the God you'll find worshipped down at the local church. You still have a collection of disparate arguments for myriad gods, not an elaborate, orchestrated collection of ideas flowing in concert toward a single God represented in any of the world's religions, or the beliefs of their followers. And perhaps more importantly, if you can unite all of these ideas into one body, but fail to make the case for a personal God, then most of the people would agree that you've failed to defend religion, as most religious people would reject your discovery as either false or at least critically incomplete. Now compare this to the single, shallow, ill-conceived, undeveloped, logical Gordian knot that is the God of common belief, and it seems that theology and apologetics are not the answer to the problems of common belief, but rather the harshest indictment of common belief. Far from making faith reasonable, it shows it to be an unworkable failure, in need of an overhaul in places and worthy of being wholly discarded elsewhere. They stand quite apart and argue ideas that only vaguely resemble the beliefs of common men. So at the end of the day, who can honestly say it was those ideas they were defending? At the end of the day, which elephant does the common man believe in? This is the Godless Heathen, signing off.